The fluorescent lights of the boardroom hummed, a flat, sterile sound that seemed to absorb all the oxygen in the air. Clara Reed stood alone on one side of a vast mahogany table, her hands clasped behind her back to keep them from shaking. On the other side sat the board of St. Jude's Medical Center, a row of dark suits and severe expressions, a tribunal of power and money. At their head was Mr. Davies, the hospital administrator, his face a mask of practiced disappointment. His voice was a low, steady drone, each word a carefully placed stone building a wall around her career. "Gross insubordination," he said, letting the phrase hang in the chilled air. "A flagrant violation of Hospital Policy No. 3B regarding public conduct while in uniform. An act which has demonstrably endangered crucial patient and donor relations." He paused, his eyes sweeping over the silent board members before landing back on her. Clara was 20 years old. She wore a simple black dress she'd bought for funerals and job interviews, a stark contrast to the light blue scrubs that were her second skin. She met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. She had learned long ago that the quietest person in the room was often the most powerful, not because they had nothing to say, but because they were listening. The hum of the lights felt louder now, pressing in. Davies leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, as if sharing a sad but necessary truth. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Ms. Reed? You're probably wondering how a 20-year-old nurse ended up here, facing down the entire board of the city's most powerful medical institution. It wasn't for money, or for fame, or for some grand ambition. It started with a simple question, in a place far from this cold, silent room. It started with an act of ordinary decency. If you stick around, I'll show you precisely how a single choice can unravel an entire system built on indifference. Like this video, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story, it doesn't just belong to me. It belongs to anyone who has ever felt invisible." This is where it all began. 24 hours earlier. The diner smelled of burnt coffee, grease, and the faint, sweet scent of maple syrup clinging to the air like a memory. It was 3 in the afternoon, that dead zone between the lunch rush and the dinner crowd, and the place was mostly empty. Clara sat in a cracked red vinyl booth, her light blue scrubs rumpled from a 12-hour shift that had felt like 20. A cup of black coffee sat untouched in front of her, its surface a dark, still mirror. She was staring into it, but she wasn't seeing her own reflection. She was seeing her father's face, the way it had looked near the end, hollowed out not by his illness, but by the endless, dehumanizing paperwork of the Veterans Affairs system. He had been a proud man, a major who had served 2 tours, and he had been reduced to a case number, a file shuffled from one indifferent desk to another. That quiet fury, the one she carried deep in her bones, was a fire banked low, always waiting for a wind to stir it. The bell over the diner door jingled, pulling her from her thoughts. A man stood there, hesitating. He was tall, leaning heavily on a pair of sleek, modern crutches. He wore a crisp white thobe and a red and white patterned keffiyeh, fabrics that seemed to belong to a world of sun and sand, not the gray, drizzling afternoon of a Midwestern city. Every eye in the diner turned to him, a current of suspicion and curiosity rippling through the quiet room. He scanned the tables, his gaze passing over empty 2-tops and landing on her 4-person booth. He moved slowly, deliberately, each step a negotiation with pain. When he reached her table, his eyes, dark and intelligent, met hers. "Excuse me," he said, his voice quiet, with a formal cadence. "May I sit here?" Clara looked at the empty seat across from her, then back at his face. She saw the flicker of exhaustion in his eyes, the subtle tightening of his jaw that spoke of more than just physical discomfort. She saw a man who was used to being looked at, but not truly seen. In that moment, he wasn't a stranger in foreign clothes. He was just a person who needed a place to rest. The stares from the other patrons were palpable, a thick, unwelcoming silence. She could feel the weight of their judgment, the easy categorizations clicking into place in their minds. But Clara's world was divided into simpler terms: people who needed help and people who could give it. She had just spent her entire day in the first category. Now she was in the second. She offered him a small, tired smile and gestured to the bench across from her. "Of course," she said, her voice clear in the quiet diner. "Please," the man, Khalid Al-Jamil, slid carefully into the booth, placing his crutches against the wall beside him. The simple act of acceptance seemed to release a tension in the room, and the low murmur of conversation resumed. He ordered a black tea with mint, his hand steady as he unwrapped the sugar packet. For a few minutes, they sat in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the clinking of cutlery and the hiss of the grill from the kitchen. It was a silence, not of awkwardness, but of mutual respect for exhaustion. Finally he spoke. "Thank you," he said, his gaze direct. "I am recovering from an automobile accident. Walking is a new skill I am relearning." He didn't offer more, and she didn't ask. Instead, she found herself telling him about her day, the words spilling out as if a dam had broken. She spoke of the veterans' ward at St. Jude's, the crumbling infrastructure, the understaffing, the quiet dignity of the men and women warehoused in a forgotten wing of a gleaming modern hospital. She talked about the faulty wiring they all ignored, the persistent leaks in the ceiling, the calls for maintenance that went unanswered for months. She wasn't complaining. She was bearing witness. He listened, his dark eyes never leaving her face, his expression one of deep, unwavering attention. He didn't offer solutions or platitudes. He just listened. It was more than anyone had done in years. When he finally rose to leave, he placed enough cash on the table to cover both their bills several times over. "You have a warrior's spirit, Nurse Reed," he said, his use of her professional title feeling like a badge of honor. "You see what others choose not to. That is a rare and valuable thing." He paused, his hand resting on the head of one of his crutches. "You showed me kindness when no one else in this room would even make eye contact. I will not forget it." He left as quietly as he had come. Clara watched him go, feeling a strange sense of peace. She didn't know his name, or who he was, or where he was from. All she knew was that for a few minutes, she hadn't felt so alone in her quiet fight. The next morning, that peace was shattered. She had barely clocked in when Hank, her unit supervisor, pulled her into his small, cluttered office. Hank was a man who operated on a frequency of low-grade fear, always worried about upsetting the complex hierarchy above him. His face was pale, his hands fidgeting with a pen. "Clara, what did you do yesterday?" he asked, his voice a nervous whisper. "We got a complaint. A formal one. From the donor relations office." He slid a piece of paper across his desk. It was an official grievance, typed in cold, bureaucratic font. It stated that a nurse from St. Jude's, identified by her uniform and name tag, had been observed in a public establishment, fraternizing with a questionable individual, causing significant discomfort to a major hospital benefactor who wished to remain anonymous. The complaint was vague, cowardly, and dripping with insinuation. "Davies has already seen it," Hank said, his eyes pleading with her. "He put a note in your permanent file. Clara, just write an apology. Say you understand. Make it go away." Clara looked at the paper, at the carefully chosen words designed to intimidate and silence. Questionable individual. Discomfort. She thought of the quiet dignity of the man in the diner, the respect he had shown her. And she thought of her father, and of all the other men and women in the forgotten wing, their discomfort ignored every single day. Make it go away.
No.
Not this time. Clara was officially placed on administrative review, a bureaucratic purgatory that meant she was barred from patient contact. Her badge no longer opened the doors to the wards. She was told to go home and await instructions. Her friend Sarah, another nurse on the floor, caught her by the elevators. "Just apologize," Sarah urged, her voice low and frantic. "It's not worth your job, Clara. You know what Davies is like. He doesn't lose these fights." But for Clara, this was no longer about her job. It was about the insidious nature of the complaint, the assumption that a man's appearance made him questionable, that a donor's discomfort outweighed a simple act of human decency. It was a microcosm of the larger disease infecting the hospital. The comfort of the powerful was paramount, while the discomfort of the vulnerable was simply the cost of doing business. It was the same logic that left the veterans' wing to crumble. That night, she couldn't sleep. The injustice of it churned inside her. She felt powerless, isolated. Then her phone buzzed with a news alert. A fire at St. Jude's Medical Center. Her heart seized. She read the brief report, her blood running cold. A small electrical fire had broken out in the West Wing, the Veterans Wing. It was quickly contained, no injuries reported. The hospital's official statement, already released, attributed the cause to a patient's faulty personal television. Clara felt a surge of cold, hard rage. It was a lie. She knew it was a lie. For 6 months, she had filed weekly maintenance reports about the ward's ancient, overloaded wiring. She had documented flickering lights, the smell of ozone after a rainstorm, the scorch marks on outlets. She had personally flagged the exact circuit panel mentioned in the fire department's preliminary notes. Her reports had been ignored, dismissed as non-critical deferred maintenance. They were going to blame a sick old man for their own negligence. They were going to bury their culpability under the ashes. This was the secondary crisis, the event that changed everything. Her suspension was about a quiet injustice, a matter of principle. The fire was about life and death. Her professional identity, the core of who she was, screamed at her to act. She was a nurse. Her first duty was to her patients, whether she was on the clock or not. She sat at her small kitchen table, the glow of her laptop screen illuminating her determined face. She opened a file on her computer labeled West Wing Maintenance. It contained copies of every report she had ever filed, complete with dates, times, and Hank's dismissive sign-offs. She attached the file to an email. The recipient was a local investigative reporter whose work she respected, a woman known for her tenacity and her refusal to back down from powerful institutions. Her finger hovered over the send button. This was the point of no return. Sarah's warning echoed in her head. It's not worth your job, but her father's weary, disappointed face was stronger. She thought of the men in that wing, who had fought for their country only to be forgotten by it. This was worth more than her job. This was worth everything. She clicked send. The next morning, the story was on the front page of the city's biggest online news portal. Negligence at St. Jude's. Nurses' reports warned of fire hazard in VA wing for months. Her name was everywhere. Her phone began to ring incessantly. The first call she answered was from Mr. Davies's office. The board requires your presence at an emergency meeting this afternoon. 4 o'clock. Don't be late. The voice was cold, devoid of any emotion. It was the sound of the executioner summoning her to the gallows. But Clara didn't feel fear. She felt a strange, liberating calm. The fight was no longer happening in the shadows. It was out in the open now. Clara walked into the boardroom at precisely 4 o'clock, a simple leather-bound binder held firmly in her hands. The air was thick with hostility. Davies sat at the head of the table, flanked by the hospital's legal counsel. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He launched directly into a character assassination, painting her as a disgruntled employee with a reckless disregard for protocol, a fame-seeker willing to endanger the hospital's reputation for her own agenda. He twisted her act of decency in the diner into a calculated provocation, her leak to the press as a malicious breach of confidentiality. She stood and listened, her composure a silent rebuttal to his theatrical fury. When he finally ran out of steam, demanding again if she had anything to say, she simply placed her binder on the polished table. Everything I have to say is in the reports I filed, she said, her voice steady. The ones you ignored. Just as Davies was about to retort, the boardroom doors opened. A young, impeccably dressed man with a calm demeanor walked in. Apologies for the interruption, he said, his voice polite but firm. My name is David Chen. I am here to represent Ms. Reed, Davies sputtered. She is not entitled to legal representation and internal review. She is when the review board is attempting to defame her as a pretext for covering up institutional negligence that endangered lives. Chen replied smoothly, taking a seat beside Clara. My client will not be answering any more questions. We, however, have a few for you. What followed was a masterclass in controlled deconstruction. Mr. Chen, with quiet precision, dismantled Davies's case piece by piece. He produced Clara's flawless employment record, commendations from doctors, and testimonials from patients' families. He presented enlarged photos of the faulty wiring, time-stamped and dated from Clara's reports. He calmly cross-referenced them with the fire marshal's initial findings. The board members, who had been nodding along with Davies, now shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The narrative was slipping from the administrator's grasp. The final blow came when the doors opened once more. Khalid Al-Jamil entered. He no longer used crutches, walking instead with a simple but elegant cane. He was dressed not in a thobe, but in a bespoke suit that radiated quiet authority. The entire room seemed to hold its breath. He walked to the head of the table and stood beside a sputtering Davies. "I believe I am the questionable individual and the subject of the anonymous complaint," Khalid said, his voice filling the room. The board members stared, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning horror. One of them, an elderly man who managed the hospital's endowment, finally recognized him. "Mr. Al-Jamil?" he stammered. "What are you doing here?" "I am here," Khalid said, his dark eyes locking onto Davies, "because the Al-Jamil Foundation is not merely a donor to this hospital. We are its largest single benefactor. And we are reconsidering our relationship." He explained how he had been in the city for post-operative care after his accident, keeping a low profile. The anonymous complaint had been a test, filed by one of his aides, to gauge the character of the institution he was supporting. "You failed," he said simply. "You chose to protect the supposed comfort of a wealthy donor over the integrity of an exemplary nurse. You chose silence and intimidation over decency. And now I learn you chose to risk the lives of veterans rather than pay for necessary repairs." He looked at Clara, and for the first time in that room, she saw the same man from the diner. The one who saw her. "Ms. Reed," he said, his voice softening, "was the only person associated with this hospital who showed me honor." The silence that followed was absolute. Mr. Davies's face was ashen. His carefully constructed world had just crumbled to dust. The story exploded. Clara became an overnight symbol, a reluctant hero for whistleblowers and patient advocates everywhere. Her face was on the news, her story debated on talk shows. But the sudden glare of the spotlight brought with it a new, unforeseen danger. A militant veterans' rights organization, one known for aggressive tactics, latched onto her cause. They saw her as a spark and were determined to turn her into a wildfire. Without her consent, they organized a massive protest, blockading the main entrance of St. Jude's. Chanting her name, they held signs with her face on them, their anger a raw, roaring force. Ambulances were being rerouted. Patients were missing appointments. The very people Clara had sought to protect were now being harmed by actions taken in her name. Davies, though stripped of his authority, seized the opportunity for one last act of vengeance. He gave a statement to the press, his voice oozing false concern. "You see the chaos this young woman has unleashed," he said. "Her reckless actions have inspired a mob, and now patient care is compromised. This is the real consequence of her insubordination." The narrative began to shift. Public opinion, once firmly on her side, started to fracture. Clara watched the news reports from her small apartment, her stomach twisting into a knot. This was her nightmare. Her quiet, principled stand was being twisted into a weapon, a blunt instrument of chaos. Sarah called her, her voice panicked. "They're saying you're responsible, Clara. You have to do something." She knew Sarah was right. She couldn't hide. She couldn't let them define her or her cause. She had to face the fire she had inadvertently helped to start. It was the most terrifying decision she had ever made. She put on her scrubs, her armor, and drove to the hospital. She walked past the news vans and police barricades, straight toward the roaring heart of the protest. The crowd recognized her, and a cheer went up. The leaders of the group tried to hand her a megaphone to welcome her as their champion. She gently pushed it away. She didn't need a megaphone. She just needed them to listen. She stood on the concrete steps of the hospital entrance, the place she had been banned from just days before, and waited for the noise to subside. "My name is Clara Reed," she began, her voice not loud, but clear and unwavering, carrying in the sudden quiet. "I am a nurse, and I am the daughter of a veteran." The crowd was silent, hanging on her every word. "Your anger is justified," she told them. You have been ignored for too long. But this, she said, gesturing to the blocked entrance, this is not the way. We cannot demand dignity for some by denying it to others. We cannot heal an injustice by creating a new one. She looked into their faces, seeing not a mob, but a collection of individuals, each with their own story of frustration and neglect. I did not speak out to create chaos, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I spoke out so that no other soldier's son or daughter would have to watch their parent fade away in a forgotten room with faulty wiring.
Please.
I am asking for your trust. Let me fight this battle where it needs to be fought. Go home. Let the ambulances through. And let us win this with honor. A man in the front of the crowd, his face weathered and his eyes full of a deep sadness, slowly lowered his sign. Then another. And another. The protest didn't break. It dissolved, melting away not in defeat, but in a quiet, powerful act of solidarity. Clara had not joined their anger. She had earned their trust. She had proven she was fighting for them, not for herself. Her appeal to the protesters was a turning point. It solidified her moral authority beyond any doubt. She wasn't an agitator. She was a leader. This act of quiet courage resonated far more deeply than the noisy protest had. It was then that the first crack in the hospital's wall of silence appeared. Hank, her former supervisor, requested a meeting with Mr. Chen. Racked with guilt, he came forward with a document he had saved, an internal memorandum from Davies distributed to all wing supervisors 6 months prior. Its subject line was operational efficiency and cost management. The memo explicitly instructed them to defer any non-critical maintenance requests in the West Wing until the next fiscal year, citing budget shortfalls. It was the smoking gun. It proved that the neglect was not an oversight. It was a policy. Armed with this new evidence, Mr. Chen filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of every veteran who had been housed in that wing for the past 5 years. The legal pressure was immense, but the final shift came from within the hospital itself. The president of the board, a woman named Eleanor Vance who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, called an emergency session. In a move that stunned everyone, she publicly disclosed that her late husband, a decorated war hero, had died in a VA hospital 2 decades earlier from a preventable infection, a result of similar systemic neglect. I have carried that failure with me every day, she told the board, her voice trembling but strong. I allowed myself to believe that St. Jude's was different. I was wrong. She personally announced Davies's immediate termination and the resignations of 2 other board members who had actively suppressed Clara's reports. She promised a full, transparent investigation and a complete overhaul of the hospital's patient advocacy and maintenance protocols. The institution, forced into the light, finally began to police itself. The battle wasn't over, but the war had been won. The focus shifted from blame to rebuilding. And at the center of it all was Clara, no longer just a nurse, but the architect of a quiet revolution. Collett had been watching from the sidelines, providing legal support through his foundation, but allowing Clara to lead. He knew this was her fight. He saw her stand up to the board, face down the protesters, and force an institution to its knees through sheer force of will and moral clarity. He wasn't just impressed, he was in awe. He had seen power his entire life, the power of money, of influence of nations. But he had never seen power like this, the quiet, unshakable power of a single person doing the right thing, no matter the cost. Months later, the autumn sun cast a warm glow on the polished new sign in front of the west wing of St. Jude's. It read, "The Major Samuel Reed Memorial Wing for Veteran Care." The crumbling facade was gone, replaced by a state-of-the-art facility with wide windows and accessible ramps. The dedication ceremony was a quiet, dignified affair. There were no self-congratulatory speeches from administrators. There were only veterans, their families, and the medical staff who served them. Eleanor Vance, the board president, spoke first, announcing the creation of a new, independent office of patient advocacy for the entire hospital network, a position with unprecedented power to investigate complaints and enforce standards. Then she offered the directorship to Clara. It wasn't a promotion. It was a recognition of the role she had already claimed. When Clara stepped up to the podium, she didn't talk about the fire or the fight. She talked about her father. She talked about the promise a nation makes to its soldiers and the moral duty to honor that promise not with parades, but with care. She spoke of dignity. After the speeches, as the crowd mingled, Khalid found her standing alone by a newly planted oak tree. He had been in the background, a silent presence, his foundation having funded the entire reconstruction without any public acknowledgement. He simply stood beside her for a moment, watching the veterans tour their new home. "You did not just fix a building, Clara," he said softly, his voice full of a sentiment he rarely showed. "You restored honor." He reached out, not to shake her hand, but to gently take it in his own. His touch was warm, firm. It wasn't a gesture of romance, not yet. It was a gesture of profound respect, of a shared understanding that went deeper than words. In that simple, quiet moment, the bond forged in a noisy diner, tested in a sterile boardroom, and solidified through a shared mission, finally became something personal, something more. The professional alliance had blossomed into the beginning of a partnership, one built not on attraction, but on a mutual recognition of strength, integrity, and purpose. The fight had cost her, but it had also given her something unexpected, something true. A year passed. Clara's new office was spare and functional, but the single large window offered an unobstructed view of the Samuel Reed wing. The gardens were flourishing. Her desk was covered in files, each one a story, a person caught in the grinding gears of the healthcare machine. She was on the phone, her voice calm but unyielding, arguing with an insurance executive over a denied claim for a new patient. The battle was different now. It was fought with policy language and appeal forms instead of leaked memos, but the objective was the same. She was still the quiet warrior. The door opened and Khalid walked in. He came here often, not as a benefactor making a grand visit, but as a collaborator. He used the leverage of his global foundation to push for the systemic changes that Clara identified on the ground. Together, they were a formidable team, targeting legislative loopholes and outdated insurance regulations. Their relationship had evolved into a steady, quiet partnership, an unspoken understanding that they were stronger together. The initial spark of mutual respect had deepened into a resilient love, forged in shared work and purpose. "Another dragon to slay?" he asked, a small, wry smile on his face. "Always," she replied, a hint of weariness in her voice, but no trace of defeat. She hung up the phone. "This one is a hydra. Every time we solve one problem, two more appear. Then we shall simply have to be more systematic," he said, unrolling a set of architectural blueprints on her conference table. They were the plans for the Al Jamil Community Health Clinic, a new facility they were building together in the city's most underserved neighborhood. It would offer free primary care, mental health services, and, at Clara's insistence, a dedicated patient advocacy center to help people navigate the labyrinth of the healthcare system. Their work was expanding. They were moving beyond fixing a broken part of the system and were now building something new in its place. He pointed to a section of the plans. "I was thinking here," he said, "for the legal aid office, close to the advocacy center. A direct pipeline." She leaned over the table, her shoulder brushing against his. "Perfect," she said, her focus entirely on the work, yet her proximity to him was a comfort, a source of strength. They were no longer just Clara and Khalid. They were a single, unified force, their personal and professional lives seamlessly intertwined. They didn't need grand declarations. Their shared mission was the greatest love story of all. 5 years later, the gardens of the Al Jamil Community Health Clinic were a vibrant testament to growth. Children played on a small lawn while their parents waited for appointments inside. The clinic was more than a building, it was the heart of the community. Clara and Khalid walked along a stone path, their steps in easy sync. They were married now, their partnership a quiet but powerful force for change throughout the state. They had funded scholarships for nurses from low-income backgrounds, lobbied successfully for new patient protection laws, and had just broken ground on a second clinic in a rural town. They passed a group of men sitting on a bench, talking and laughing. Clara recognized 2 of them from the old VA ward at St. Jude's. They now worked at the clinic as certified peer support counselors, guiding other veterans through their recovery. The institutional change they had fought for was no longer a policy on paper. It was a living, breathing reality, embodied in the people whose lives had been transformed. They stopped at a bench overlooking a small rose garden. A young nurse in familiar light blue scrubs walked by, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and fierce determination. She gave them a tired but respectful nod. Clara smiled, a deep, genuine smile that reached her eyes. It was a face she recognized, a reflection of herself from what felt like a lifetime ago. Khalid followed her gaze, understanding completely. "It all started," he said softly, his hand finding hers, their fingers lacing together in a familiar, comfortable gesture. With a question in a diner, Clara looked from the young nurse to her husband, her partner, the man who had seen her when she felt invisible. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of the trees above them. "It started with a choice," she corrected him gently, her voice full of a quiet, unshakable certainty. To make room for a stranger, they sat together in the warm afternoon sun, two people who had changed the world not with a shout, but with a whisper, proving that the most profound legacy often begins with the smallest act of grace.